Thank you everybody for joining. Super excited to kick off TMF Week 2021. I have a lot of different folks on the line, so I'm going to let everybody fold in. We are 9:01 Eastern, so we're going to give everybody maybe a few seconds to join, and then we'll kick it off and introduce the conference. We've got some amazing sessions planned this morning, as well as a little bit later on today. So we'll kick that off in a few seconds. Can everybody in the chat hear me? So can anybody just write in the chat if you guys can hear me okay? Amazing, perfect, thank you, fellow panelists. Okay, first of all, thank you so much everybody for joining. Let us know where you're dialing in from in the chat, what city, country that you're coming in from. Let us know, where you're coming in from TMF Week today. First of all, I want to thank again, obviously, everybody for joining not only today's session, but registering for the conference. We have literally thousands of you that have registered for TMF Week, which is an amazing, amazing achievement. And it just shows how great this community is at coming together to continue to learn, grow, and develop as professionals. I'm going to go through a few different slides just to introduce the conference, as well as the speakers that we have today. But before I do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. So all of the sessions that are running at TMF Week will be recorded and available following the event within the platform. So give the platform a few minutes, and then the recording will be available following the session, including the one that you're in at the moment. All attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for the entire TMF Week conference. Unfortunately, not for each session. We have 30 sessions, almost 50 different speakers. It's just a lot for us to be able to do certificates for every session. So we're going to be doing it for every single registrant for the whole conference. That will be something that we'll probably send to you roughly 7 days following the event. Okay. Following every presentation, there will be networking breaks. This year, for those of you that were part of our platform last year, we did things a little bit differently, but this year we have an online event platform where not only can you sit in and view presentations, but you are also able to network with your peers. There are over 1,500 of you in TMF Week this week. You are able to network with other TMF professionals from all over the world if you head over to the lounge. So after every session, there will be a 15-minute networking break and then a 45-minute networking break at lunch, where you guys are able to sit at tables and talk about specific subjects. You can also chat with some of the organizers, the organizations that power essentially TMF Week, including Montreal, but also other organizations that are participating as speakers or have contributed in some way to developing the TMF Week program. So just head over to the exhibit hall for that. I can see all of my advisory board on my stream, but none of you can yet. But I'm just going to introduce them all. We've had a huge amount of success from last year in terms of building the program, but none of this would have been realized without this star-studded cast that we've assembled for the advisory board. The advisory board's job for TMF Week 2021 was really to deliver the best possible trial master file and ClinOps conference available, and I think we've really done that. So I want to do a big special hand to everybody that was involved, including the TMF Week. So we've got Paul Fenton, who's the president and CEO of Montreal. We've got Fran Ross, who's a TMF practice director at Advanced Clinical. We have Donna Dorozinski, who's the CEO and president of Just in Time GCP. I'm going to try and remember everybody's job titles now. We've got Jamie Toth, who is the Senior Director of Clinical Systems and Processes at Daiichi Sankyo. And then we've got Dawn Nickham, who's the Senior Director of QA and Compliance at Inception Group. I really hope I got all of that right. So thank you to the advisory board for being a part of this event. I really, really appreciate everybody at Montreal really appreciates the effort that you guys have put in to deliver such an amazing program. So to get down to business, so we have the first session, the opening keynote, and it's a little bit different. It's not a traditional topic that you typically find at a TMF conference, and that's just kind of a little bit what we like to deliver at TMF Week. So our opening keynote today is going to be focused on decentralized clinical trials, anticipating the impact across study teams. Thankfully, I'm joined by somebody I've personally followed for quite some time, who's been doing some amazing things in the decentralized clinical trial space, Craig Lipset. Craig is the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners, providing advisory and board leadership with pharma, tech, and venture capital to bring vision and driving action at the intersection of research, digital solutions, and patient engagement. He is the co-chair for the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, serves on the board of directors for the foundation of Sarcoidosis Research and MedStar Health Research Institute, as well as the editorial board for therapeutic innovation and regulatory science. I should have practiced that word beforehand. Craig is adjunct assistant professor in health informatics at Rutgers University, an adjunct instructor in the Center for Health and Technology at University of Rochester. Craig was the former head of clinical innovation and venture partner at Pfizer, on the founding operations committee for Transcelerate Biopharma, and on the founding management teams for 2 successful startup ventures. Craig has been listed among the Pharma Voice most inspiring people in the life sciences, pharmaceutical executives, emerging leaders, CenterWatch top 20 innovators in clinical trials, and the AliWatch Who's Who in eHealth. So with that, I'm going to add Craig to the stream. Apologies for messing up your intro there, Craig.
Not at all, Oliver. It's good to see you. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to sharing and learning with this group.
Amazing. So let me just stop sharing my screen, and Craig and I'll allow you to share your screen. What I will suggest while Craig is setting up his presentation is, if you have questions for Craig, please add those questions into the Q&A box. We will be reviewing that at the end alongside the advisory board to throw as many questions as we can at Craig while we have him. So Craig, with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Oliver. It's so great to be here with this audience. When I was first asked to help open up this exciting week, I thought, well, I'm hardly a TMF expert. But the committee came back and said that's really what they were looking for, to bring a little bit of diversity into the conversation before you start digging into so many of the current issues and concerns around TMF and the industry today. Let's be a little expansive and help share some other trends that are happening elsewhere across the clinical development space. And so with that in mind, I'm excited to share a little bit about some happenings around decentralized trials and try to include a few considerations for what this might mean for all of us in all of our roles. I'm not going to recap any of my background, which Oliver went through extensively, other than to say Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, a tricky one to say. It's a relatively rare condition, but thanks so much for walking through that bit of background, Oliver. Well, the topic I'm going to share for a few minutes, set up for conversation and hopefully your questions, is around decentralized trials. And I'd like to just start with a little perspective on definitions and jargon. I'm including 2 definitions on this slide, one from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, CITI, which, if you're not familiar, is a public-private partnership with the FDA hosted at Duke University, as well as a definition from the Innovative Medicines Initiative, IMI, in Europe, another public-private partnership, and this coming from their Trials at Home project. In each of these definitions, you can sort of extract a lot of common themes. The definition of decentralized is inclusive of using both innovative digital technologies as well as changes in our processes. And in both cases, with the goal of enabling more flexible participation from locations other than a traditional investigator site. Now, at times, I'm sure we all see this model called by a lot of different names. We see in the headlines words like virtual trials, remote trials, siteless trials. I'll tell you why I'm using decentralized here. For one, I think that virtual as a term is probably a lot easier for people to grasp, but for many in the regulatory community, virtual suggests the use of modeling or other types of data-driven approaches in lieu of enrolling prospective patients in a study. So for example, using synthetic data or synthetic control arms in lieu of enrolling control arm patients. Remote trials, siteless trials can all mean different things. Decentralized is just the jargon a lot of the regulatory community have aligned around. In the lower left, an example, as I mentioned, with Citi back in 2018, using the term decentralized trials, again, on an initiative that was heavily influenced and with leadership from the FDA. In the lower left, an example from a document the FDA published just earlier this year called their PrEP document, their Pandemic Readiness Plan. I'll drop a link in the chat when I'm done with this section of talking, but the PrEP document's a great resource for people. It shows the FDA's thinking on the silver linings from the tragedy of the pandemic. What were those areas that we changed and adapted that we should sustain going forward? In the middle on the bottom, the example of the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence using the term decentralized just last month, and a call for those who are submitting regulatory submissions in oncology to the FDA to call out areas where data was collected using remote and decentralized approaches so the FDA can learn. And then in the lower right, these examples not isolated to the FDA. That's a position published about 2 weeks ago by the Danish Medicines Agency, also speaking about decentralization and decentralized trials. Now, for most over the pre-pandemic period, the use of decentralized trials leaned heavily around the participant. How might decentralization improve recruitment, retention, diversity, patient control, and empowerment? That's a graphic on the left from CTTI. On the right, I've added an additional value proposition, which we've seen from 2020, which is how does decentralization provide resilience and business continuity in uncertain times like we saw over the last year. Now, the history of decentralized trials predates the pandemic. This is actually a slide I presented in January of last year, showing the 17-year history prior to the pandemic of decentralized trials, dating back to some early work at Boston University, at UCSF, some early work by Lilly, looking at hybrid approaches, removing certain visits to replace with the internet, and then the remote trial from Pfizer that we first started to design back in 2007. You'll see that it's kind of select examples until 2014, but in the 5 or 6 years leading to the pandemic, a flurry of activity, new ventures launched, significant funding starting to be introduced in this area, over 100 million in venture capital investment prior to the pandemic, with investors coming from interesting places, pharma, big tech, showing up to invest in and support this area. In fact, one might have thought, looking at this slide, that decentralized had hit its adoption point, that there was all this activity taking place. But in fact, the message that accompanied this slide was we had more supply than demand. With CROs, startups, and so many others announcing capability, one would have thought that these approaches were being widely adopted, but at most, many pharma had individual experiments, one-offs taking place here or there, nothing happening really at scale in terms of adoption. This oversupply in the market clearly worked to our advantage last year, because when lockdown struck and new approaches were needed to sustain and maintain patient access to investigational product, to maintain our ability to monitor patients for safety, to maintain our ability to capture critical data around efficacy and safety of our medicines, we needed these approaches. And in many cases, approaches existed with actually oversupply available. Coming out of the pandemic, well, I can't really say we're coming out, but at least starting to see some daylight on the other side. We're starting to see what go-forward models are looking like. Many pharma companies today are taking a toolkit-like approach. And the big message here being that decentralized doesn't necessarily mean that the entire study is being done in a digital and remote way. Because what we're seeing is many pharma looking at their portfolio and identifying what decentralized research methods they need to have to include in their studies going forward. These are digital tools like electronic consent, remote patient monitoring, modernized digital endpoints, as well as process capabilities like home health and visiting nurses, the ability to work with local imaging centers and local labs, often supported by centralized independent review. In some cases, partnering with centralized investigator sites, and in many cases, having processes and partners that can support extending their supply chain to people's homes. How do we get investigational product, whether a small molecule or a large, into a patient's home, and in some cases infused in the patient's home? Along with those new capabilities, what are the changes that are needed to SOPs, training, and our protocol templates? Now, that's all in step one for most implementations today. Step two is, when we have an individual protocol, how do we best pair the right decentralized research methods with any given study? Often there's a collection of selection criteria that operators are considering, regulatory and other global feedback, patient insights that are being captured, and considerations around the mechanism of delivery of the medicine, the safety profile and phase of development. Many operators, though, are ultimately constrained today primarily by culture and just how much change they can manage and absorb and support within any individual study. And I think that's fair, because many operators are still figuring out their support model for many of these approaches. So while many studies, and I'll say that there are a number of pharma companies today that are already setting pathways to scale for that story, that are already establishing models where every protocol is being reviewed, their visit schedules being considered for what different choices for how and where a visit can take place before that protocol is finalized. But global adoption isn't easy. We still have significant regulatory ambiguity. Many countries where we're just unclear on positions within different therapeutic areas. Where we do have an understanding, we have variability on a country-by-country basis in terms of what's acceptable, not just from a regulatory perspective, but legal and policy around topics like privacy. For those that are focused on the data and data flow, technology can often be a challenge in these studies. We're using different types of devices in many cases, and often interoperability starts to creep in as a significant challenge. We have to make sure our external stakeholders, investigators, and patients are ready for these approaches. But more often than not, one of the true rate limiters here are the endpoints themselves. When we're relying on legacy historical measurements for our trials, they are often designed to only be acquired inside of an investigator site. And when that takes place, we're really limited in terms of how much we can enable flexibility and home-based participation. A great example over the last year for many has been the 6-minute walk test, a very common endpoint from heart failure to movement disorders. A 6-minute walk test is typically having a patient come to the clinic to walk for 6 minutes, often in a hallway with 2 cones in the hall placed at about a 30-meter distance apart with heart rate being monitored. We know that there are studies showing that we can use digital approaches as an alternative for a 6-minute walk test, using a smartphone or a smartphone coupled with a wearable device. But we can't make changes to our endpoints in the midst of a pandemic. That shift requires runway. We need at least 18, 24 months to run the studies to validate that newer approach in our particular disease area. And if we didn't have the time and planning for that, then we're often stuck, requiring patients to travel just for an endpoint to be measured. Now, I'll call out here that another barrier for us is often just our jargon. You know, as I mentioned earlier, most operators aren't implementing fully remote, fully decentralized trials right now. In most cases, it's more of a hybrid approach, and we often hear about hybrid trials today. But what do we even mean when we're describing a hybrid trial? Is it a hybrid study by site, meaning that perhaps some patients are going to a local investigator site while other patients are being seen at a remote or virtual site, in particular those that don't have geographic proximity to a conventional brick and mortar site in our study? Or does hybrid mean it's hybrid by visit, where all patients are starting off at a brick and mortar site, but some visits can be done in remote ways? Or is hybrid for this particular study a blend of these different types of archetypes and with different approaches mixed together? Because of some of the challenges of operating that we've just discussed, a number of companies have come together to form a new nonprofit collaboration. I'm honored to serve as the co-chair for the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, DTRA. This is a global nonprofit collaboration now with over 120 member organizations that span from the US FDA and leading pharma and biotech to most all of the major CROs, tech companies supporting our space, innovators with new capabilities, advocacy groups, site networks, and others. The focus, the goal for DTRA is exclusively around the global adoption of decentralized research made easier. DTRA, our members have defined 4 areas of priority for the organization. The first being around definitions, as I mentioned, our archetypes, our different key performance indicators, so that we can all make sure we're speaking the same language. How do we better define some of these different models? For many operators who are struggling with implementation, very often a best practice exists. And so how can we help identify and communicate those best practices, making sure that they're available for all? While we have over 100 member organizations in DTRA, we don't have 100% of the hearts, minds, and souls. How can we use data and evidence to help educate and grow the community that understand how to implement decentralized research and the value proposition that that brings? And then finally, while in some cases there may be best practices and others there are true sustaining barriers, how can we identify those and work together to mitigate those barriers? So beneath each of these 4 priorities, DTRA members have identified a total of 12 initiatives that are going live over the coming weeks. These 12 initiatives are meant to address these 4 priority areas, with many of them having at least some incremental readout by early next year. DTRA is aimed for work product to be publicly available, not just for our members. And so the goal here is to raise all boats and to lift the entire community. But we also appreciate that DTRA is not the only multi-stakeholder initiative, society, or alliance that has a work stream or other effort hitting on decentralized research. In fact, we've identified over a dozen other organizations, from Transcelerate and Citi to SCRS and ACRO, the American Telemedicine Association, the IEEE, BIO, and so many other great organizations. DTRA's goal is to advance decentralized research. It doesn't mean we have to own all the work that's going on, but we want to make sure we're mapping it, tracking it, and communicating it, that we're collaborating where it makes sense to achieve our shared goals, and enabling handoffs in other instances, but under all situations, making sure that there is an avoidance of redundancy and that all resources can be aimed together. Now, as I think about decentralized and what it might mean to different stakeholders, whether in TMF or in other spaces around the organization, I'd encourage many that are working in pharma, CROs, or elsewhere to make sure that you're engaging with your internal DCT coordinating team. And trust me, if you're in a mid-sized pharma or a large pharma, a CRO of most sizes, there is some group that's already working on this. As you saw in that last slide, there's over 120 member organizations in DTRA, and all of these have a centralized effort coordinating DCT implementation. Don't wait and assume that decentralized trials are a long way off. Yes, fully remote, fully decentralized trials are not going to be mainstream in the near term, and that's okay. They're not necessarily what patients are telling us they want. Hybrid may actually be the desired end state in many cases. And so don't wait with the assumption that decentralized trial is some future state. These hybrid approaches are the implementation in many cases, and those are taking place in organizations all across our industry today. This shift will only further emphasize the use of digital communications technologies, in particular for communications with research participants. And so certainly that will have implications for those that are thinking about our master files. And then certainly we may be seeing new team members introduced, roles such as the visiting nurse and home health, often now even being written in protocols. Some of these stakeholders maybe weren't even in our RACI charts, in our roles and responsibilities and other maps in the past. And so how do we make sure that we're anticipating some of these new roles and what that may mean? I'm going to close by playing the role of futurist for just a moment, and then I'm going to look forward to any questions you may have. First off, expect the future to emphasize choice and flexibility for research participants. Forcing a patient to participate from home is no more patient-centric than forcing them to travel to a clinic. The future for so many of us in all of our lives is one that's hybrid. We see it every day. We see it in how we're looking to go back to the office, where we're, in many cases, headed back, but headed back a little more flexible, enabling many to work from home when it makes sense using online virtual technologies and come in when it makes sense. We see the same whether we're grocery shopping or dining at restaurants. That future of hybrid makes sense. And what does that mean for research studies? It means organizations looking at each visit in that schedule and the protocol and identifying not if it's at home or if it's in the clinic, but where can it take place? What are the options we can make available for our participants? And how do we avoid chaos by making sure our endpoints are resilient for that kind of flexibility? We also can expect certain futures where the research sites themselves are empowered to make better use of their own technology. Many research sites have capability when it comes to electronic informed consent. Many that are also in clinical practice certainly have telemedicine tools available. There was a 65% increase in the use of telemedicine technologies by physicians across the United States last year. Our doctors know how to use telemedicine today. In fact, when surveyed by WCG, 75% of research sites indicated they plan to continue to use telemedicine after the pandemic. And yet, in a multi-center trial, sites are challenged with sponsors and CROs passing down technology that's unfamiliar, that doesn't fit their workflow, on which they haven't been trained. And in many cases, not being able to make use of tools that they already have, that they've invested in and trained upon. I think we'll start to see that shift with areas like electronic consent, as well as certain uses of video, where sponsors and CROs will instead start to focus on the elements that matter, the minimum quality standards, so we can define that a site can use their own tech, and the minimum around interoperability. For example, in electronic consent, simply being able to share signatures, dates, and versions. These are the things that we as operators care about. What platform the site chose to use should be have a little more flexibility. And then finally, watch for how decentralized starts to open up new opportunities, in particular, opportunities for us to engage treating physicians that we've often marginalized in our trials, the doctors who are not investigators but are in the community and where patients are obtaining care. And how does decentralized models and the role of a remote investigator start to enable local doctors to play a role that can be very supportive to a study and start to include them? Well, that's all I have to share with you today, hopefully just to kick off some great conversation. I'm looking forward to your questions, and Oliver, I'll turn things back over to you. Oliver, it wouldn't be 21 if I didn't say you're on mute.
There you go. Hear me okay now?
Yes, sir.
There it is. There it is. Perfect. I'm going to add a few folks to the stream. So let me just give a few seconds here. All right. I think we're back online. Can everybody in the chat let us know if we're back online?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. I'm going to add Fran back. All right, so we had some other questions. I had a question from Donna, but Donna is having some internet issues, so I'm going to ask it on Donna's behalf. So Donna wanted to ask, how do we navigate this approach to decentralized clinical trials in the parts of the world where maybe access to technology is limited? I imagine this is a question you probably get quite often, Craig.
That's a great question. And you know what, that question is fabulous for a number of reasons. For one, there's so much enthusiasm today to try to address racial and ethnic disparities in research participation, and so much hope that even in developed parts of the world, that decentralized can be a part of the solution towards diversity and inclusion. But only if done correctly, right? We can't make assumptions, even in developed parts of the world, that people have access to a high-speed internet, to connected devices. And so we need to be able to provision devices in order for people to participate. Provide options wherever it makes sense for those that have a technology that can fit the study profile and prefer to use that, but always be prepared both within both developed regions as well as developing regions of the world to make sure that we're provisioning any technology that's needed for people to be supported. We need these new approaches to open doors for access and participation, not open some while closing others.
Amazing. There's a couple of other questions here, but I'll let my fellow advisory board members go first. Is there any questions from the advisory board before I go to the audience? Perfect. Craig, what do you expect the ratio of remote, hybrid, and then traditional clinical trials to be in let's say, a decade, if you were to look into the future a little bit?
You know, I'll even compress down from a decade, because I think even in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see the shift starting to me to look more of an 80-10-10 mix. I expect that over the next 3 to 5 years, easily 80% of studies can include some element of decentralized. 10% may be on a path to being fully remote or fully decentralized, and 10% may have no role for anything decentralized just because of the nature of interventions or drug delivery. The real question then to me is, over the next decade, what does that 80% actually look like? Because for some may point and say, if we're using an electronic diary and electronic consent, aren't those decentralized methods? And so wouldn't my study count in that 80%? And I would say it does. But then the real question is, how many decentralized approaches are right for a given study that are starting to be a part of that 80% of studies that can have at least a hybrid-like approach? And so I think as operators build confidence, we'll certainly see more and more studies, including more choices for patients. I think that over the next 24 to 36 months, as we see regulatory decisions being made based on the studies that were running in 2020 that included decentralized approaches, we'll start to see more adoption. And so I think that operator confidence is certainly going to increase, and that will help everybody with including more choice for patients in those studies that are hybrid.
Okay. To build on your point around the regulators, so we had a question here. What is the general position of the regulators regarding decentralized clinical trials and decentralization in general? Is there going to be some flexibility included in the new and revised ICH E6 R3 guidance? What are you seeing, Craig, in terms of how the regulatory landscape is evolving towards decentralization?
That's a great question. Even prior to the pandemic, we saw a lot of regulatory activity around this topic. It was the FDA stakeholders at CTTI that launched the Mobile Digital Trials Initiative that resulted in the set of recommendations back in 2018 that are currently being updated, supporting decentralized approaches. And the IMI in Europe, likewise, with its close engagement with European regulators. Last year, in the heat of the lockdowns of the pandemic, when global regulatory authorities were issuing guidance on running studies during the pandemic, most of all of them spoke in very supportive ways of using remote approaches for at-home participation. But importantly, none of those guidances lowered the bar for our operators. They simply encouraged adoption of approaches that already existed. And so there aren't new regulatory rules or norms that are necessarily needed here. In the US, the FDA has indicated in their prep document to expect guidance from them on decentralized trials. We saw this from the Danish authorities. And we're looking to see to what extent, as some people have hinted, that Danish set of recommendations may start to turn into one that's more EU oriented instead. But to your point, R3 is proving to be a very important resource as well, and certainly triggering some considerations along with other innovative study designs of including decentralized research among those innovative study approaches.
Okay. I will take one more question, or I will fire one more question at Craig from the advisory board if there is any last questions. If not, we will allow Craig to continue on with this day. All right, perfect. Well,
I will just share my gratitude with this group for convening such an amazing audience, and I look forward to learning more on TMF with all of you this week. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Craig. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys all for sticking around for the keynote. I hope you all found it incredibly useful, as I did, in learning more about a subject that I think is becoming more and more prevalent. Thank you for all your questions. We're going to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about the program for this week. I'm going to allow the advisory board to introduce the days that they represent. So, of course, for those of you that registered will know that TMF Week comprises of 5 days over the course of a week, where there are a series of sessions either in the morning or in the afternoon or wherever you're dialing in from on a number of different subjects. And each day is covering a slightly different topic. And we have our advisory board who is responsible for each of the days. I noticed that Donna is having some issues with the internet this morning, and so is Fran. So I will introduce day 1 and day 2, which is what Donna and Fran are responsible for, and then I'll hand it over to my advisory board to introduce their respective days. So in terms of today's schedule, of course, this morning we had the keynote that just finished with Craig Lipset. Following this, we have a networking break for 15 minutes. And then at 11 a.m. Eastern, we have the first session of today's program, which is going to be focused on the benefits of artificial intelligence in eTMF, how to better your overall eTMF health and quality with new technology. And then following the session, at the end of every day this week, we will have a panel discussion. And so the panel discussion today at 12:30 p.m. Eastern is how does TMF health impact study quality? We have Donna Dorozinski, who's the president and CEO of Just-in-Time GCP, Mallory Sayer, who's the manager of eTMF at Moderna, Christina Monastero, who's the associate director of clinical compliance at Adaptimmune, and Lorianne Werner, who is the director of quality and compliance at Just-in-Time GCP. So that is day 1's program. In terms of day 2 is focused on TMF startup and investigator site files. So for those of you that have joined us from the site, thank you for participating in TMF Week. In terms of the schedule for tomorrow, the first session of the day will be focused on bridging the ISF TMF divide. What roles should sponsors and investigators play? And then following that session, session 2 at 10 a.m. Eastern, is the foundation of the clinical trial story starts with study startup. So really focusing on the study startup phase. And then again, finalizing the day with a panel discussion, which is led by Fran Ross, who's the TMF practice director at Advanced Clinical, which is going to be covering the universe of startup records. How do we make it easier? So I think we're going to talk a lot. We're going to bring a lot of content from probably the keynote from Craig today to follow on that. We have Fran is joined by Radwa Ali, Seneca Harrison, and Etienne Hinton, all representatives from the clinical research field at clinical sites or institutions. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie. And Jamie, give us a rundown on what's happening on day 3.
Sure. So following on day 3 is my favorite topic, sponsors and CROs. And so we're going to kick off the day with Daniel Bennett from Galecto talking about the many changing faces of sponsor oversight and how the TMF fits in. Then we're going to move on to Nicole Weigel from Daiichi Sankyo, and she's going to talk about TMF through the eyes of a clinical study associate. To kind of get that glimpse of what the clinical study associate really goes through when they are looking at the TMF. Following that, Stephanie Viscomi from Alexion, she's going to give us some great insights into TMF oversight with the multi-vendor eTMF ecosystem. And then we'll wrap up the day with a panel, and that panel is going to discuss the D3O of oversight, so data-driven decisions, and that panel will be chaired by yours truly, and we have Tanya from Syneos, Karen from Merck, Kate from Bluebird Bio, Mary from MNK, and Mof from WCT, all part of that panel. So stay tuned, it's going to be a great panel, a lot of great experience on that panel that will be shared.
Amazing. Super excited for that day. Thank you so much for the introduction there, Jamie. So day 4, we jump into the inspection standards and regulations. Dawn, I know that's one of your favorite areas of discussion. What's going on day 4?
Yeah, definitely. And we will be doing a deeper dive into the backbone of what I say all activities, come from. So we'll start out day 4 with Richard Golden, actually from Inception. That's going to talk about periodic review and how that helps you mitigate some of the inspection chaos. Then we'll move to Russell Joyce and Stu McCulley. They're going to talk about real-world evidence, which really does dovetail very nicely into what we talked about today around decentralization. But how does that change our TMF collection? How do our documents change? And they should, and they will. Then our Montrium's own Paul Fenton will be talking to us about how we can draw other parts of standardizations within the industry and how can we pull that into TMF. Certainly some of our industry has already done a really good job with that. How can we drive that more into the TMF as well? And then of course we'll have our panel at the end of the day that I will be leading. We're going to talk about some of the updates to ICH, E6R3, as well as E8, and how does quality by design change how we do our TMF. That panel will be joined by Barbara Novak, Judy Zahara, and Jim Markley, and will be a great listen. So look forward to that day.
Amazing, thank you, Dawn. And then last but absolutely not least, we have the last day, which is focused on technology, although technology will of course play a role throughout the conference. But there is a focus more on the future of eTMF and how technology can empower the future. What do we have going on day 5, Paul?
Well, we have a lot of stuff going on day 5. We're going to kick it off with a presentation, kind of like a case study on the steps for success when implementing an eTMF. So this is kind of, for those that have never implemented an eTMF before, great session. It will give you some really good insights. And that's a session that's being presented by Tatiana Esquivel. I hope I pronounced her name correctly, from Allphase, which is a growing CRO here in Canada. And our own Maisha Rahim, who's our customer experience lead. After that, Catherine Cinciarelli and myself will be talking a little bit about how we can take a more integrated approach when we're looking at our information and our systems, and maybe thinking about how we organize stuff a little bit differently to help sort of decision making. So we'll also be looking at things like quality by design and building in quality into our processes within our system and bringing all of those systems together. And then our third presentation of the day, which I think is super interesting, is all about data. Obviously, data is becoming more and more important within the world of TMF. We're going away from documents, going towards data. And so we need to think about that really carefully. How do we manage all of that data? How do we integrate it? And there's kind of two approaches. It's either data lakes, which you'll learn about if you don't know what that is on Friday, or system integration, which is kind of more classic. So that is a presentation that's being presented by Nizi Nazim, who's from Daiichi Sankyo. So I'm really looking forward to that one, because I think it's an area that we all need to start to focus on. And then we have our star-studded panel at the end of the day to close the conference. And for this panel, we've brought together some real veterans from the industry who've got really great insight. They've been doing this for a long time. They understand what the TMF is all about and the eTMF is all about. And more importantly, they've got a clear vision in terms of where we're going in the future. So we're going to be asking them, how do they see the next generation of eTMF systems? What kind of feature set are we going to have in there? And what are the things that we should be focusing on that we maybe don't have today in our current generation of eTMF? And so that's it. Really great day planned, and really looking forward to it. And back to you, Oliver.